The Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, with the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Northern General Ulysses S. Grant at the courthouse in Appomattox. Trusting in Lee's honor, Grant accepted the Southern general's word that he would go home and no longer take up arms against the Union. Incredibly, Lee and his soldiers left Appomattox that day astride their horses, with their guns still on their shoulders. Grant felt he could trust his opponent after having served beside Lee throughout the U.S.-Mexico War. The generous terms were offered in hope to set the stage for healing the divisions that had caused the Civil War. Although Lee remained true to his word, there were many who sought to keep the South in an open state of rebellion. Foremost among them were John Wilkes Booth, who managed to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln just 6 days later during a showing of a play at Ford's Theater. His death brought Andrew Johnson to the presidency, something that no one had thought possible. You're listening to A Push Through History, a resource designed for students completing the course of AP US History. This episode covers the final portion of Period 5, 1848 to 1877, the Reconstruction of America. Johnson had been placed on the Republican ticket in an attempt to send a message of national unity. He had been the only U.S. senator of a Confederate state to remain loyal to the Union. Johnson had also been a slave owner, purchasing 10 different individuals while supporting the Democratic Party's pro-slavery agenda. He even went on the record endorsing the false pseudoscience that slavery was the result of one race having more intelligence than another. During the Civil War, Andrew Johnson came to support emancipation as a way to punish the Confederate elite. He freed his own slaves on April 8, 1863, after his state, Tennessee, had outlawed the evil practice. Although he reached the right conclusion, he did so 3 months after the Emancipation Proclamation had ordered their freedom in rebelling states. Now Johnson, the former slaveholder himself, was to oversee the reconstruction of the United States of America. The two most pressing issues were how to care for the thousands of newly freed individuals and how to punish the Southerners who had rebelled against the Union. 3 Reconstruction plans were put forth. First was Lincoln's original plan, which provided amnesty or forgiveness to most ex-Confederates. Additionally, 10% of the citizens of each Southern state would have to take a loyalty oath, and all states would have to approve of the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. The second plan was put forth by a group of congressmen known as the Radical Republicans. They sought to pass the Wade-Davis Bill, which would force the majority of each state's white men to pledge an oath of loyalty. Next, each state would have to form a new government composed of 100% non-Confederates. Those governments would be forced to adopt the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But the plan didn't stop there, as those who had risen in rebellion would be permanently stripped of their voting rights. This more radical option eventually fell afoul of Lincoln's clever use of a pocket veto. The third plan was Johnson's limited Reconstruction plan, which gave amnesty to any white who signed a loyalty oath, including individuals like Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, the instigator of the Pillow Massacre of unarmed African American troops during the Civil War. Under this plan, states would have to abolish slavery and pay their war debts. But Johnson's plan never carved out a role for African Americans, giving them no vote in the selection of the new leaders of the rebellious states. Johnson began the process of Reconstruction with the intention of enacting his plan, which essentially reinstalled slavery beneath a different name. He pardoned 13,000 former Confederates, proclaiming that, quote, white men alone must manage the South. Each state rewrote their constitution, but Mississippi didn't ratify the 13th Amendment, the one that proclaimed slavery was illegal until 2013. Despite the limited advancement of rights, the rebelling states were readmitted and took their seats in Washington, D.C. in December of 1865. The group sent to Washington included 58 Confederate congressmen, 6 men who had served in President Jefferson Davis's cabinet, 4 Southern generals, and Alexander Stephens, the now former vice president of the Confederacy. Although the president declared Reconstruction done right then and there, the Congress wasn't quite so sure, refusing to let the new congressmen take their seats, setting up a fight with the president and prolonging the Reconstruction era. The radical Republican Congress passed a law establishing the Freedmen's Bureau, a group which would assist former slaves as well as poor whites in the South by distributing clothing and food. In the next few years, the government agency would set up 40 hospitals, 4,000 schools, 61 industrial institutes, and 74 teacher training centers. They would have likely done more, but suffered constantly from a lack of government-apportioned funds. The Congress also passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which overturned the ugly Dred Scott precedent by granting all African Americans citizenship in the United States, while simultaneously outlawing any state from passing discriminatory laws that severely restricted African Americans' lives. Although all slaves had been freed, states like Mississippi and South Carolina had passed a series of laws known as Black Codes. These laws prohibited blacks from carrying weapons, serving on juries, testifying against whites, marrying whites, and/or traveling without permits. A few states even made it illegal for black men or women to own land. The Congressional Civil Rights Act would have utilized the Supremacy Clause to override such discriminatory state policies. President Johnson, however, used his ability to veto that act as well as the Freedmen's Bureau, proclaiming that this is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government of white men. Race riots in 1866, including a particularly violent one in Memphis, which resulted in the death of 48 African Americans, as well as the destruction of all 12 of the city's black schools, provided enough support for Congress to push back against Johnson and override his veto, something that can only happen if 2/3 of the House and Senate agree. Now in total control, the radical Republican Congress passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which threw out the previously accepted governments of the southern states, replacing them with military generals who would rule the newly created 5 military districts of the South. South Carolina was lumped in with North Carolina beneath General Daniel Sickles. Tennessee, President Johnson's home state, was the only rebellious state to avoid being placed in a military district. The military occupation would only end after voters, including African American men, had a say in the creation of new constitutions which ensured African American men the right to vote. The radical Reconstruction era was a time when the United States began to tackle the immense challenge of rebuilding the South while simultaneously securing rights for millions of newly freed African Americans. Following the Civil War, the country faced deep divisions, and figuring out how to reunite a broken nation was no easy task. As such, the Radical Reconstruction Act became a turning point in American history, Besides dividing the South into 5 military districts, each governed by a Union general, the goal of the act was clear. Before a state could rejoin the Union, it had to meet several critical requirements. First, states were required to grant the right to vote to African American men, while simultaneously stripping voting rights from former Confederate leaders. Second, military commanders in the South had to oversee the registration of eligible voters, both black and white, while ensuring that new state constitutions guaranteed black suffrage. Finally, the states had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born in the United States, including former slaves. Tensions between President Johnson and Congress hit a boiling point in 1867, with each side looking for opportunities to destroy the other. Congress struck first, after Johnson fired Edward Stanton, the Secretary of War appointed by Abraham Lincoln. A president firing a member of his cabinet seems like normal business, but in this case it sparked a political firestorm. Congress had previously passed a Tenure of Office Act, which proclaimed that cabinet officials couldn't be fired without approval of the Senate. Since Stanton had been appointed by Abraham Lincoln, Johnson believed that he had the right to make such a personnel decision. In response, the House of Representatives impeached Johnson, accusing him of high crimes and misdemeanors. The impeachment trial lasted 11 weeks, with Johnson being charged on 11 counts of misconduct, mostly related to violating the separation of powers by defying Congress. When the Senate finally voted, however, they fell just one vote short of the 2/3 majority needed to remove Johnson from office. Although he remained in power, Johnson's influence was effectively neutered for the rest of his presidency. The 1868 presidential election saw Ulysses S. Grant emerge as the Republican candidate, after riding a wave of popularity from his actions during the Civil War. Grant supported radical Reconstruction, but also pushed for reconciliation between North and South. The Democrats nominated Horatio Seymour, but his candidacy was doomed from the start, as the Democrats still hadn't shaken off the stain of disloyalty from the Civil War. Grant won decisively, capturing 214 out of 294 electoral votes. Under Grant's presidency, Reconstruction policies deepened. One of the most significant milestones was the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote to all male citizens, regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. While this amendment was a monumental achievement for African American men, it didn't come without compromises. The amendment allowed for the possibility of poll taxes and literacy tests, which were designed to keep certain groups, such as poor whites and immigrants, from voting. But the group that was most affected by the policies were newly freed African Americans in the South. The 15th Amendment also did not extend the right to vote to women, despite calls from leading suffragettes like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. This caused a deep rift within the women's rights movement. Some, like Frederick Douglass, argued that black male suffrage had to come first, given the violent repression African Americans faced in the South. Douglass famously said, "When women, because they are women, are hunted down, dragged from their homes and hung on lampposts, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own." Stanton and Anthony, however, were deeply disappointed and chose to form the National Women's Suffrage Association, dedicated to pursuing voting rights exclusively for women. Meanwhile, despite new freedoms, many African Americans faced crushing economic challenges. Under President Johnson's amnesty plan, plantations that had been confiscated during the war were returned to their former white owners, leaving freed slaves with little to no land of their own. Without land, most had no choice but to return to work for their former enslavers. The result was the rise of sharecropping, a system where freedmen would rent land and pay for it with a portion of their harvest, typically half of it. However, because many freedmen started with nothing, they quickly fell into debt. Storekeepers loaned money at high interest rates, further trapping sharecroppers in a cycle of poverty that would last for decades, if not for the rest of the century. Despite these hardships, some efforts were made to help. In South Carolina, a land commission established in 1869 purchased property and resold it to landless freedmen on easier terms, allowing 14,000 black families to secure farms. But overall, the dream of land ownership remained out of reach for most. By the early 1870s, the Union League, a secret Republican organization that began during the Civil War, played a vital role in helping African Americans navigate the new political landscape. The League organized meetings and educated newly enfranchised black voters on political issues and voting procedures, working alongside the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau not only helped former slaves with basic needs, but also established colleges like Fisk and Hampton Institute, which focused on training teachers and uplifting the newly freed population. Known today as part of the network of historically black colleges, these schools paved the way for creating economic opportunities for Southern African Americans. Still, many white Southerners resented the presence of Northern carpetbaggers and Southern scallywags who supported Reconstruction. African Americans were also making strides politically, with some holding political office for the first time. Robert Smalls, a former slave turned Civil War hero, and Blanche K. Bruce, the second black U.S. Senator from Mississippi, were among these pioneering leaders. Reconstruction brought sweeping changes, but also deep resistance, which ultimately led to its unraveling. The beginning of the end came in 1874 with the death of Senator Charles Sumner, one of the fiercest champions of radical Reconstruction. Sumner's death left the radical Republicans leaderless and diminished their influence in Congress. The political landscape was shifting, and the momentum for a racially just South began to falter. But more was at play than just political leadership. A widening chasm was growing between the goals of freedmen who wanted land, education, and autonomy, and the priorities of Republican policymakers, whose main focus was to reincorporate ex-Confederates into the Union and build a booming national economy. It was becoming clear that Northern political leaders, more concerned with national unity and economic growth, were losing interest in enforcing the rights of freed African Americans. Adding to this growing disillusionment were voices like James Pike, whose book, The Prostrate State, claimed that South Carolina had fallen into a state of black barbarism. The author's portrayal of African Americans as unfit to govern fueled racist resentment in both the North and South and weakened support for the very idea of multiracial democracy. But the blows to Reconstruction didn't stop there. The Grant administration, already seen as heavy-handed in its military approach to the South, was rocked by scandal, further discrediting the Republican leadership. One of the most infamous was the Credit Mobilier scandal of 1872, where key Republican lawmakers were implicated in a scheme involving the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad. Executives at the Crédit Mobilier company created fake construction contracts to siphon millions of dollars into their own pockets while giving congressmen stock in the company to ensure their silence. That was followed by the whiskey ring scandal of 1875, where a group of politicians, distillers, and government agents defrauded the federal government of millions in whiskey tax revenues. Even Grant's private secretary, Orville Babcock, was implicated in the ring, but Grant shielded him from prosecution, deepening public mistrust and undercutting Grant's ability to oversee Reconstruction. The scandals undermined the Republican Party's moral authority. President Ulysses S. Grant, once the war hero who had saved the Union, became associated with corruption and cronyism. Although Grant himself wasn't directly involved in most of these scandals, his loyalty to corrupt aides and his failure to crack down on them damaged his reputation. The public was growing weary of what they saw as a corrupt and ineffective administration. While political scandals rocked Washington, the economy delivered another gut punch to Reconstruction. The Panic of 1873, a worldwide depression, hit the United States hard, and it began with the collapse of the Northern Pacific Railroad. The railroad had been backed by Jay Cooke, a financier who had helped manage Union finances during the Civil War. When his firm went bankrupt, it set off a chain reaction, triggering the collapse of other financial institutions and sending shockwaves throughout the economy. The public blamed Republican financial manipulation, seeing the party as responsible for the collapse. The economic fallout was catastrophic. Factories and railroads shut down and unemployment skyrocketed. Within a year, half of America's iron mills had closed, and by 1877, over 50% of the nation's railroads had gone bankrupt. Tens of thousands of industrial workers lost their jobs, leading to a surge in wandering tramps, desperate for work, camping by railroad tracks. Farmers were hit hard too, as crop prices plummeted and their livelihoods disintegrated. The once thriving Reconstruction-era economy had grounded to a halt. In the South, the situation was even more dire. Southern states, which had hoped for massive Northern investment to rebuild their shattered economies, found themselves left behind. Northern investors, already burned by Confederate bond defaults, were unwilling to risk more capital in the unstable South, especially after the Panic. Southern state debts mounted rapidly as public projects like railroads, public schools, and health services became too expensive to maintain. The economic downturn also exposed widespread corruption in Southern Republican governments. The Republicans had banked on economic growth to sustain Reconstruction, but when that growth didn't materialize, state governments struggled to make ends meet. In some cases, officials resorted to bribery and fraud to keep projects moving. For example, one former Union general doled out more than $200,000 in bribes and loans to legislatures in exchange for millions in state funds for railroad construction. The railroads, however, were never built. Officials instead speculated on bonds and pocketed the money. Even respected black leaders weren't immune to scandal. Robert Smalls, a hero of the Civil War who had become a state legislator in South Carolina, was convicted of accepting a bribe. Although he was later pardoned, the case weakened the fragile trust between African American leaders and their communities, as well as between Republicans and their supporters in the North. The collapse of the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company in 1874 was another devastating blow to African Americans. This private bank, closely associated with the Freedmen's Bureau, had promised to safeguard the savings of former slaves. Thousands of black depositors had put their faith in the institution, but mismanagement and reckless investments led to its failure. When the bank collapsed, 61,000 depositors lost their savings, and Congress refused to compensate them. Many freedmen, already struggling to survive in the new economy, were left destitute and disillusioned. As the economy crumbled, so did the resolve of many Northern politicians and voters to continue the costly and controversial project of Reconstruction. Classical liberals within the Republican Party, advocating for free trade, small government, and a limited electorate, began to criticize the interventionist policies of radical Reconstruction. These liberal Republicans, tired of government corruption and Northern involvement in the South, eventually called for a return to laissez-faire economics and sought to limit voting rights to educated, property-owning men. In 1872, these disgruntled Republicans formed the Liberal Republican Party and nominated Horace Greeley for president. Greeley, a former abolitionist, now called for reconciliation in the South. The Democrats, still in disarray, also backed Greeley, but he was a poor campaigner and failed to inspire confidence. Grant won re-election, but the fractures within the Republican Party were deepening, and the public support for Reconstruction was wearing thin. Meanwhile, Southern resistance to Reconstruction grew increasingly violent. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror and intimidation to suppress black political participation and drive Republicans from office. Southern Democrats, calling themselves Redeemers, vowed to redeem their states from Republican rule and restore white supremacy. They systematically dismantled Reconstruction reforms through both legal manipulation and brutal violence. President Grant courageously took on the KKK, but only after he received congressional permission to do so, which was unfortunately far too late. The Enforcement Acts were the first time that the federal government had ever claimed the power to prosecute crimes by individuals under federal law. It sent in a cadre of federal prosecutors who had been specifically trained for dealing with groups like the KKK. Additionally, they were able to rely upon the occasional suspension of habeas corpus to ensure that individuals with known affiliations to the Klan wouldn't be serving on their juries. Hundreds were eventually arrested and sent to jail, ending the first phase of the Ku Klux Klan. By the late 1870s, Northern resolve to enforce Reconstruction had all but collapsed. The cost of military intervention in the South, combined with economic hardship and political scandal, had worn down public support. Only a full-scale military occupation could have kept Reconstruction alive, but the North no longer had the willpower to continue. In 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, marking the official end of Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1877 settled a dispute between Democrat Samuel Tilden and Republican Rutherford B. Hayes over who would succeed Grant in the Oval Office. Tilden from New York had won his own state and most of the South, which would remain staunchly Democratic for another half-century. The election was contested, however, in Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, and Oregon. Unfortunately, the Constitution had not yet figured out what to do in the case of such claims. As such, Congress froze, not knowing which house or which method was needed to resolve the impasse. The commission that was appointed voted along straight party lines, awarding every single disputed vote to Rutherford B. Hayes, resulting in Tilden, the popular vote winner, by an astounding 300,000, losing by a substantial margin. Brinkley tells us that behind the resolution of the deadlock, however, lay a series of elaborate compromises among leaders of both parties. When a Democratic filibuster threatened to derail the commission's report, Republican Senate leaders met secretly with Southern Democratic leaders to work out terms by which the Democrats would allow the election of Hayes. According to traditional accounts, Republicans and Southern Democrats met in Washington's Wormley Hotel. In return for a Republican pledge that Hayes would withdraw the last federal troops from the South, thus permitting the overthrow of the last Republican governments there, the Southerners agreed to abandon the filibuster. Reconstruction's collapse by political compromise left the South's racial and social hierarchies largely intact. The federal government abandoned the freedmen, leaving them vulnerable to a new era of oppression. The promises of equality, land, and freedom faded as Jim Crow laws and sharecropping entrenched a system of racial segregation and economic exploitation for generations. This ultimate failure of Reconstruction was on display for everyone to see, with noted civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois eloquently stating that Reconstruction had been a tragic failure, not because it was ill-conceived, but because the nation lacked the will to see it through. We'll never know the truth of the matter, but it matters that we know the truth of that statement. The Reconstruction Amendments ought to have been enough to end slavery and discrimination along racial lines, but its subsequent limited interpretation meant that the amendments lacked power. Besides the exodusters, African Americans wouldn't leave the South in large numbers until the Great Migration beginning in 1910. This meant that their political futures rested in the hands of the men who had deemed them property. Reconstruction did greatly increase access to education systems. 4,000 schools were set up in the wake of the Civil War, with half of the 9,000 teachers being from African American descent. The benefits were felt by all residents in the South, and by 1876, more than half of all white children and about 40% of all black children were attending schools in the South. Early efforts at integrating the schools, however, faltered. Although the freedmen schools allowed individuals of all races, whites universally chose to not attend, preferring academy schools instead. Reconstruction also attempted massive land redistribution. The effort began when General Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, which would have seized large plantations and redistributed the land to the freedmen, giving reparations for the damages that slavery had wrought. The promise became commonly referred to as 40 acres and a mule. Johnson's appointment to the nation's highest office led to a reversal, allowing for the restoration of all Confederate land rights. Still, black land ownership increased during this period from 0 to roughly 20%. Historian Alan Brinkley notes that in some respects the post-war years were a period of remarkable economic progress for African Americans, if the material benefits they had received under salary are calculated as income. Then pre-war blacks had earned about a 22% share of the profits of the plantation system. By the end of Reconstruction, they were earning 56%. At the same time, the per capita income of Southern whites declined by 35%, representing one of the most single-income redistributions in American history. But it wasn't enough. Banking shifted to a crop-lean model, which saw general stores hand out credit measured against the crops that one could provide. A few bad seasons in a row meant that farmers became hopelessly trapped in debt. Since white farmers retained the most fertile land, these debt traps were far better at catching African Americans. Once stuck in the debt cycle, it only made sense to plant cash crops in order to catch up, meaning that the crop-lean system actually intensified the monoculture hold that King Cotton had upon the South. as we conclude our exploration of the Reconstruction era, we are left with a legacy of profound complexity. Reconstruction was a time of immense ambition, as the nation sought to rebuild itself and redefine the meaning of freedom and citizenship. Yet it was also a time marked by deep resistance, systematic inequalities, and the political and economic pressures that ultimately curtailed its progress. The triumphs, though limited in education and some economic advancements, demonstrated the resilience and determination of newly freed African Americans. Yet the institutionalization of black codes and other state-level obstructions underscored the enduring challenges of dismantling the structure of slavery and racism. The scandals, economic crises, and eventual withdrawal of federal support paved the way for the resurgence of white supremacy under the guise of home rule redeemers. Looking ahead to the Gilded Age, we see the stage set for a different kind of transformation. The Reconstruction era's struggles over civil rights and federal versus state power foreshadowed new battles in a rapidly industrializing nation. The Gilded Age would usher in economic expansion and technological innovation, but also stark inequalities, labor unrest, and ongoing debates about whose voices and lives mattered in the American narrative. In many ways, the unresolved tensions of Reconstruction continue to echo, shaping the challenges and opportunities of the late 19th century. The promises of Reconstruction, some realized, many deferred, remind us that history is not a straight line, but a conversation, one in which every generation plays a part.